The first sign was the silence, not the comfortable quiet of an autumn morning, not the soft hush that follows a light snowfall, when the world pulls a white blanket over itself and breathes slowly. This was something else entirely. This was the silence of held breath, the silence of a predator that has already chosen its prey and is simply waiting for the right moment to move. It fell over the Montana territory like a hand pressed flat against a drum. One moment the wind had been speaking in its usual low, indifferent voice across the browning grasslands, rattling the dried seed heads of the switchgrass, pushing thin clouds across a sky the color of old pewter. And then it stopped. The crows that had been arguing in the cottonwood stand at the creek's edge went quiet mid-sentence. The creek itself, which should have run cold and clear for another 3 or 4 weeks before the hard freeze, had already begun to slow its edges, laced with a thin, milky ice that had no business being there in late October. Maren Voss felt the silence before she heard it, or rather before she noticed the absence of sound. She felt it in the base of her spine, a low vibration that was less a sound than a warning, the kind of deep animal knowledge that her grandmother, Sigrid, had told her never to dismiss. The body knows things the mind takes weeks to understand, Sigrid had said, once pressing a warm, rough hand against the back of young Maren's neck. When your spine tells you something is coming, child, you believe it. You prepare. Maren was 19 years old and she was alone and she was preparing as best she could. She stood at the splitting stump 20 feet from the half-finished cabin that her husband Eric had begun building in the hopeful warmth of the previous spring, before the fever took him in July. The axe in her hands was his, a good one, with a hickory handle he had shaped himself and a head he had paid too much for at the trading post in Coldwater Flats. She had been at this work since first light. Her shoulders burned with the particular deep ache of muscles that had not been built for this kind of labor but had been forced into it by necessity. Her palms beneath the worn leather of Eric's gloves, which were 2 sizes too large for her hands, had developed a new geography of blisters and calluses over the past 6 months, a landscape of small, hard-won toughness that she examined sometimes in the evenings, the way a traveler might study a map of unfamiliar country. The wood pile to her left was not large enough. She knew this with a clarity that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with mathematics. She had counted the logs. She had calculated as best she could how many she burned on an average night in the small iron stove that sat in the center of the cabin's single room, its pipe disappearing through a rough hole in the unfinished roof. She had divided the pile by the number, and the answer she arrived at was somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks of fuel if she was careful, if she was disciplined, if the winter was ordinary. Looking at the sky to the north, feeling that silence pressing down from the Arctic, like a great gray thumb, Maren did not believe the winter would be ordinary. She split another log. The axe came down clean, the wood falling apart in 2 neat halves that she stacked without pausing. She had learned to be efficient. Efficiency, she had discovered in the months since Eric's death, was the only luxury still available to her. The land stretched out around her in every direction. 30 acres of it legally hers and heavily mortgaged to the Territorial Land and Development Company, whose local agent was a man named Roland Kress. The front portion of the property, perhaps 18 of those 30 acres, was flat and workable, or had been workable in theory, though Eric had managed to break and plant only about 4 of them before the fever burned through the settlement. The back portion was something else entirely. Where the flat grassland ended, a long, low ridge of gray granite pushed itself out of the earth, like the spine of some enormous buried animal, running roughly east to west along the rear boundary of the property. The stone was old and cracked and weathered to a dull, almost bluish gray. It grew nothing useful. It broke plow blades. It offered no timber, no pasture, no water. It simply sat there massive and indifferent, as if it had been placed as a reminder that not all things in this world existed for the benefit of human ambition. Roland Kress had told Eric when Eric had first negotiated the purchase of the land that the granite ridge was essentially worthless, a geological liability he had called it, with the smooth confidence of a man who had given the same speech many times and expected it to land the same way every time. Eric, young and optimistic and entirely in love with the idea of land ownership, had agreed quickly and paid the reduced price that Kress had offered for the parcel, not understanding, or perhaps not wanting to understand, that the reduced price was not generosity but calculation. The land agent knew something that Eric Voss did not. He knew that the settlers of Coldwater Flats could be sold not just land, but a complete philosophy of survival. A packaged, purchasable faith in the power of modern technology to defeat the ancient hostility of the Montana winter. The centerpiece of this philosophy, the altar around which the whole congregation gathered, was the North Star Hearthmaster stove, a cast-iron behemoth that Kress sold with the fervor of a revival preacher and the margins of a confidence man. It was, he insisted, the pinnacle of domestic heating technology, a furnace capable of fighting back even the most savage territorial cold. The settlers had believed him. They had torn out their old stone fireplaces, the kind that had served their grandparents and great-grandparents, and installed the gleaming black machines in their place. They had sealed their cabins with modern tar and sawdust, chinking convinced that the secret to surviving a Montana winter was to seal the outside world away entirely and place their faith in the glowing belly of the Iron God. Marin had no such faith. She had the iron stove that Eric had bought before they married, the one that sat in the center of the unfinished cabin and consumed wood, at a rate that made her stomach tighten every morning when she opened the damper. She had 30 acres of debt. She had a single thin cow named for no one in particular, because naming animals too specifically felt like inviting grief. She had Eric's tools, his gloves, his axe, his memory pressed into every surface of the half-built walls around her. And she had the pity of her neighbors, which she had discovered was the coldest thing in Coldwater Flats, colder even than the wind that came down from Canada, with nothing to slow it for 1,000 miles. They looked at her the way people look at something they have already decided is lost. The women of the settlement brought food in the first weeks after Eric died, their faces arranged in expressions of compassionate certainty, and Marin had accepted the food and thanked them, and understood without anyone saying so directly that the food was not kindness, so much as it was the early payment on an obligation they felt toward the memory of a man who had died too young. She was not the recipient of their care. She was the occasion for it. The men were more direct in their assessment, as men often are when they believe a woman cannot hear them. They said in the way of men who confuse bluntness with honesty that the Voss property was not viable for a lone woman. They said the cabin would not stand a proper blizzard. They said the woodpile was insufficient, and the soil too poor, and the debt too large. They said it in the general store and over their fence posts, and in the low carrying murmur of the saloon, and none of them, not one, offered to come and help her split wood, or finish the cabin's roof, or negotiate with Roland Cress on her behalf. She split another log, then another. The rhythm of it was almost meditative now. The lift and the fall and the crack, and the stacking, a cycle that cleared the mind of everything except the immediate, which was exactly what she needed. It was while she was in this state, her mind emptied by labor, her body moving on its own accumulated knowledge, that she heard the sound of hooves. Not the quick, light hoofbeats of a neighbor's horse passing on the road, but the slow, deliberate cadence of a horse being ridden by someone who owned the ground beneath it. She did not stop working. She set another log on the stump, lifted the axe, brought it down. Roland Cress rode into her yard on a tall, dark horse that snorted great plumes of steam into the freezing air. He was a large man in his early 50s, broad through the chest and shoulders, with a face that had been handsome once and had settled into something merely authoritative, the kind of face that expected to be listened to and was rarely disappointed. He wore a heavy wool coat with a collar of dark fur, and his boots were the expensive kind, the kind that had been made to fit a specific foot and no other. He rode with the easy comfort of a man for whom horses were tools he used well and thought little about. He did not dismount when he reached her. He sat on his horse and looked at her the way he looked at parcels of land he was assessing, with a calculating detachment that was not quite contempt, but was not quite anything warmer either. Marin set the axe against the stump and waited. "Mrs. Voss," he said. His voice was a low, carrying baritone, the voice of a man who had learned early that volume was less important than certainty. "The company has completed its review of your account." She said nothing. The habit of silence had grown in her over the past 6 months, like a second skin, a protective layer between herself and a world that had too many opinions about her situation. "Your husband, God rest him, was 6 months in arrears on his land payments at the time of his passing." Cress paused, as if the mention of God required a moment of decorum, though the pause had the practiced quality of a gesture performed so often it had lost its original meaning. "Out of Christian charity, the company extended you an additional 2 months upon notification of your circumstances. That extension has now concluded." He walked his horse in a slow circle around the yard, his eyes moving over the half-finished cabin, the inadequate woodpile, the dwindling stack of hay near the cow's shelter. He stopped before her, his horse's breath clouding between them. "Mrs. Voss, I will be direct with you, because I believe directness serves everyone better than false hope. This is not a viable holding, not for any lone farmer, and certainly not for a woman alone." He gestured toward the cabin. "This structure will not withstand a serious blizzard. The roof is unfinished. The chinking is inadequate. Your wood supply is at a generous estimate 6 weeks of fuel in a mild winter." He let his gaze travel to the gray ridge at the back of her property, and something in his expression shifted toward what might have been satisfaction. "And that ridge. Half of your acreage is dead granite. You cannot plow it. You cannot graze it. It produces nothing and will produce nothing. It is geological dead weight, and it has always been thus. He brought his eyes back to her face, and what he was looking for there, she thought, was resignation. He was a man who had delivered this speech or versions of it many times, and he knew its usual effects. "The company is foreclosing on the property," he said. "It is not a decision made lightly, and it is not a decision made without regard for your welfare. Quite the contrary. The company is in foreclosing, doing you a kindness you may not presently recognize." Marin's hands were still. Her face was still. Somewhere behind her eyes, something was burning a fire that had nothing to do with warmth. "You have until the first significant storm closes the pass," Cress continued. "At that point, you are to vacate the property. Take your cow and your personal effects. The church in Coldwater Flats has arrangements for cases such as yours. There is no shame in accepting what the land itself has already determined." He looked at her then with the magnanimous expression of a man who is about to deliver what he considers the most generous part of an already generous proposition. "You are young, Mrs. Voss. 19 is not a life sentence. There are other possibilities for a young woman of your situation. The town has need of capable hands in the boarding house, in the laundry operation Mrs. Pemberton runs. Do not let stubbornness cost you what good sense might preserve." He pulled on his reins, turning the horse. He paused once without quite looking back at her. "Do not be stubborn about this. The land has given its verdict. There is no wisdom in arguing with stone." He rode away. The sound of his horse's hooves on the frozen ground traveled clearly in the impossible stillness of the air, and then even that faded, swallowed by the silence that had been building all morning, the silence that lived in Marin's spine. She stood in the yard for a long moment after he disappeared around the stand of cottonwoods at the road's edge. She did not move. She looked at the cabin, her husband's unfinished dream standing patient and broken in the pale light. She looked at the wood pile. She looked at the thin line of the cow's back over the shelter wall. And then her eyes went to the ridge. Geological dead weight. Useless granite. Those were the words Cress had chosen, and he had chosen them with the confidence of a man who had never once considered that the things he could not use might nonetheless have value. Something moved in Marin's memory. It was faint at first, the way things are faint when they have been kept in a drawer for a long time and are being exposed to light for the first time in years. It was the memory of warmth of a kitchen in a different place, a place she had last seen when she was 12 years old. The memory of a woman's hands, large and capable, gnarled at the knuckles from decades of cold, but always, always warm to the touch. The memory of a voice with an accent that softened certain consonants and stretched certain vowels. A voice that told stories of a volcanic island in the far North Atlantic, where the ground itself breathed, where hot water bubbled up from the rock as naturally as rain fell from the sky. Her grandmother, Sigrid's voice. And with the memory of the voice came the memory of the books. Marin went inside. The trunk sat at the foot of the narrow bed she had shared with Eric for 11 months and slept in alone for 6. It was a heavy thing made of dark wood reinforced with iron bands, and it had traveled with Marin from her parents' home when she married as a bride's chest, carrying the linens and the small domestic objects that were considered the proper currency of a young woman beginning a household. But beneath those linens, beneath her mother's wedding dress wrapped in cotton, beneath a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, there was something else. She knelt beside the trunk and began lifting things out carefully, setting them on the bed. The wedding dress, the letters, a small wooden box of her mother's jewelry that would have bought her 2 weeks of food if she were willing to sell it, which she was not. A wool shawl that had belonged to no one she could remember. A child's boot. A single one that had somehow made it into the trunk by mistake and had traveled with her ever since, too strange and too small to discard. And then her hands found them. 3 volumes thick and heavy, bound in what she recognized as sealskin worn to a soft gray at the corners from decades of handling. The journals of Sigrid, her grandmother, written in a language Maren could read only in fragments, the old tongue of a volcanic island in the North Atlantic. The one Sigrid had spent her whole life speaking, and her whole life trying to translate into a country that did not have the right words for what she was trying to say, but tucked into the front cover of the first volume held there, with a strip of leather tied through a small hole someone had punched in. The corner was a smaller book, a hand-stitched booklet, the pages cut unevenly and sewn together with thick thread. On the cover in English, in her grandmother's careful and deliberate hand, a primer for my Prairie granddaughter. Maren sat on the edge of the bed with the booklet in her hands and did not move for a full minute. She had known this booklet existed. Her grandmother had told her on the last day Maren had seen her alive 7 years ago, when Maren was 12 and Sigrid was already beginning the slow, dignified decline that would take her 2 years later, that she had written something down, something important, something for later when later became necessary. Maren had not opened it. She had carried it with her from her childhood home to her married home, packed carefully at the bottom of the trunk. And she had not opened it, not because she had forgotten it, because opening it felt like admitting that later had arrived. And for a long time she had not been ready to admit that. She opened it now. The first page was not instructions. It was a letter. Sigrid had written it in English carefully, with the slightly formal construction of someone writing in a language they have learned as adults and have never quite made fully their own. But the formality did not diminish the warmth. If anything, the precision of it, the sense of Sigrid choosing each word deliberately from among the options available to her, made it more intimate, not less. My Maren Sigrid had written, "If you are reading this, then the later I told you about has come. I am sorry for the difficulty of your later. I would have made it easier if I could have. But I did not know how to give you what I am giving you in this book without first letting you live enough to need it. The knowledge in these pages is not comfortable knowledge. It is not the kind of thing you can use when life is easy. It is the kind of thing that becomes possible only when easy has already gone. And what remains is the harder shape of things. You will understand what I mean when you read further. I love you, child. I have always been warm. Now you will know why." Maren read the booklet through that first night by the light of a tallow candle. And when the candle burned to its end, she relit it from the stove and kept reading. And when the second candle burned down, she wrapped herself in the wool blanket and held the pages up to the faint orange glow of the stove's draft vent and kept reading until her eyes refused to stay open. She slept for 3 hours and woke before dawn and read again. What Sigrid had written was not a memoir. It was not a story, not in the conventional sense. It was a manual, a technical manual written with the love of a woman who understood that love expressed as knowledge is the most durable kind, the kind that persists even when the woman herself is gone. Sigrid had grown up on a volcanic island in the North Atlantic, a place where the earth was thin and restless and full of its own energy, where hot water came up from the ground in dozens of places, where the steam that rose from the hillsides in winter was not a curiosity but a resource. The resource, the thing that had kept people alive on that cold island for 1,000 years, while the rest of the world was chopping down its forests to feed iron stoves. She had written about the old hot spring houses, dwellings built not on the earth but in relationship with it. She had written about the specific art of reading landscape not for its agricultural potential, but for its thermal character, how to identify geothermal activity from the surface before you ever put a tool to rock. The discoloration of certain stones where mineral-heavy water had seeped and dried over decades. The specific varieties of moss and lichen that grew preferentially in areas of subtle ground warmth. The kinds that colonized volcanic soil and were never found on cold granite. The faint sulfurous smell of hydrogen sulfide, the earth's own breath carried on the wind from even a deeply buried spring. She had written about construction. This was the heart of the booklet, the section most dense with sketches and cross-sections and detailed annotations. How to widen a natural fissure safely working with the rock's existing fracture lines rather than against them. How to carve a system of shallow channels in the stone floor radiating out from the heat source, designed to carry hot water across the entire living space before draining through a sump. The principle, she had noted, was ancient. The Romans had used it, calling it hypocaust, though the Romans had needed fires to heat their water, and Sigrid's island had needed no fires at all. Hot water flowing through stone channels would heat the flat stones above them, and those stones would radiate a gentle, constant, bone-deep warmth that no iron stove could replicate, because the iron stove made a small, fierce heat that dissipated quickly in all directions, while the stone floor made a slow, pervasive heat that rose evenly and stayed. She had written about ventilation at length with underlines for emphasis. The earth gives warmth, she had written, but she also gives dangerous air. Carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide could seep from an active spring in sufficient quantities to be harmful. The solution was not to avoid the spring but to manage the air. A tall chimney on the highest point of the dwelling built to exploit the stack effect. The natural tendency of warm air to rise and create a draft behind it would pull the bad air upward and out, while drawing fresh air in through a low inlet near the entrance. She had drawn diagrams of this system with the precision of an engineer, the chimney proportions, the inlet placement. The way to position a bafflestone to prevent the cold incoming air from traveling directly across the living space before it warmed. She had written about water. Condensed water was possible inside a warm, steam-laden cave, collecting on the cooler surfaces near the entrance. A careful arrangement of shaped stones at a low point, what Sigrid called a cold trap, would concentrate this condensation and allow it to drip into a collection vessel. The water collected this way was pure distilled by the earth's own heat, and then condensed again, free of the mineral content of the spring water itself. She had written at the end of the technical sections as a kind of coda about philosophy, about the foolishness of men who spent their lives in battle with the land, fighting the cold with iron when the greatest fire in the world burned without cost just below their feet. "The earth gives," she had written. "She is not a beast to be broken. She is a mother to be understood. Find her breath. Feel her pulse. And she will keep you warm when the sun itself grows cold." But it was the final page of all the one that had been folded separately and tucked behind the back cover that Marin almost missed entirely. It was written in a different ink, darker as if added later and with greater deliberateness. There was a last section, a postscript of sorts that read, "I have seen the valley you will settle in, my Marin, though you do not know this. Your father showed me the land agent's maps when your family first spoke of coming west. I recognized the valley from the geological surveys. The ridge formation on its southern boundary sits above a fault line I know well from my island studies. I chose to say nothing then. Some knowledge must arrive in its own time. But I will say this now. In these pages you will find when you need them. The land they will tell you is worthless is the land I would have chosen for you myself. Trust the ridge. Trust the earth beneath it. It has been waiting longer than any of us." Marin read that final page 3 times. Then she sat very still for a long time. Sigrid had known. Not in the vague way of a grandmother's intuition, but in the specific practical way of a woman who had studied volcanic geology on a North Atlantic island and had looked at a land agent's survey map of a Montana valley and had recognized what was there. She had known, and she had said nothing, and she had written it down for later, trusting that later would come and that Marin would be equal to it. The weight of that trust was enormous. Marin sat with it in the cold cabin, the stove ticking beside her, the night pressing in from all sides, and she felt the weight of it not as a burden but as a kind of ballast, something that steadied her at her center when everything else was moving. She closed the booklet. She sat at the small table in the cabin's single room and looked at the wall opposite her, which was also the wall that faced the ridge, the useless granite, the geological liability that her grandmother had looked at on a map and recognized as a gift. She looked at her hands. They were the hands of a 19-year-old woman who had been splitting wood and hauling water and doing the labor of the farm alone for 6 months. The softness was gone from them. What was there instead was something that felt to her like the beginning of capability. Though it was a beginning so recent, she was not yet confident of it. The task ahead was by any rational measure impossible. To widen a fissure in solid granite rock using hand tools, to carve channels in a stone floor, to build a chimney from mortared fieldstone, to create from raw materials and old knowledge a dwelling place that could sustain human life through the worst winter in living memory. Alone. In the weeks remaining before the hard freeze made outdoor work impossible. It was impossible. She knew it was impossible in the same way she had known 6 months ago that managing 30 acres of debt and an unfinished cabin and an insufficient wood supply alone was also impossible. And she had been doing that impossible thing one day at a time since July. And here she still was. She did not make a decision exactly. Decisions have a before and an after, a moment of choosing between options. What happened in Marin Voss on the morning of that second day was less a decision than an alignment, the way a compass needle aligns to north. Not by choosing to point that direction, but because that is what it is made to do, because that is the only direction available to it once it is set free. She put the booklet carefully back inside the first journal and put the journals back in the trunk and closed the lid. She put on her coat and Eric's gloves and went outside. The wind was picking up from the north again, carrying with it something that felt like a message, a reminder of what was coming and how little time remained. The sky had taken on the particular gray-white color that the old-timers in cold water flats called fish belly sky, the color that preceded the worst weather. She walked to the ridge. She walked the length of it slowly, perhaps a quarter mile from one end to the other, then back again. She did exactly what Sigrid had described. She looked for discoloration staining on the rock face where mineral-laden water might have seeped over centuries. She looked for the specific mosses, the dark, heat-preferring varieties, clinging to the cracks and ledges of the granite. She pressed her bare palms, pulling off Eric's oversized gloves, against every fissure and crack she could find, holding them there long enough to feel the difference between cold stone and slightly less cold stone. She found nothing. The rock was gray and cold and indifferent, exactly as Roland Kress had described it. She walked back along the ridge a third time, slower now, her hands raw from the cold, her hope dimming in proportion to the failing afternoon light. The sun was already low, the shadow of the ridge falling long and dark across the frozen grass. Another hour and it would be dark, and she would have accomplished nothing, and another day would be gone. She was near the eastern end of the ridge, the end that her grandmother's final note had not specifically identified, but that the geological logic of the booklet suggested was the most promising, when her foot caught on an exposed root and she stumbled, putting out both hands to catch herself against the rock face. Her palms hit the stone flat, and she felt the shock of it travel up her arms, and then she stayed there for a moment, catching her breath and her face close to the rough gray surface. Behind a dense curtain of gnarled juniper trees, 3 or 4 of them growing so close together and so low that their branches intertwined into something almost solid, there was a deeper shadow, a gap in the rock face that the junipers had been hiding from casual view. She would not have found it walking the face of the ridge directly. She could only see it from this angle close to the rock and off to one side. Maren pushed the juniper branches aside with her forearm, the needles sharp against her skin, and pressed into the gap. The cold air of the late afternoon seemed to thin. She reached out and laid her hand against the rock on the right side of the gap and felt beneath her palm something she had spent the entire day looking for and had nearly given up on finding. Warmth. Not heat. Not a fire's heat. Nothing so dramatic. But warmth, gentle and steady, a living warmth that pulsed up through the rock from whatever lay beneath it. And with it so faint she might have imagined it so subtle it barely registered against the cold bite of the ambient air. The smell. Sharp, distinctive, unmistakable to anyone who had read Sigrid's careful description of it. Sulfur. Hydrogen sulfide. The breath of the earth. For a long time Maren stood with her hand pressed against that warm stone and did not move. The juniper branches surrounded her, their sharp smell mixing with the subtler scent of the earth beneath. The last light of the day came through them in slants. The cold was still there, present and serious and patient. But beneath her hand, through 3 or 4 inches of ancient Montana granite, something was alive. She thought of Sigrid. She thought of the old woman's warm hands, always warm, even in the deepest winters on that distant volcanic island. She thought of the booklet, the careful English sentences chosen one at a time by a woman who understood that some knowledge could not be given until it was needed, and that the need when it arrived would be unmistakable. She thought of that final folded page, the postscript written in darker ink. I would have chosen this land for you myself. Trust the ridge. Marin pressed her forehead gently against the warm rock. She did not cry. The time for crying had been 6 months ago, and she had done her crying then alone in the cabin in the August heat, while the women of Coldwater Flats sat in her yard and spoke quietly to each other, in the way of women who are accustomed to grief. She had done her crying, and she had gotten back up, and she had kept moving, and now she was here in the fading light, with her forehead against a warm stone in Montana. And she was not crying. She was something better than that. She pulled back from the rock. She let the juniper branches settle back into place. She stood for a moment in the cold, exhaling slowly, watching her breath cloud and thin and disappear. The eastern sky had already deepened to the blue-black that precedes true dark. The first stars were appearing small and hard and very far away. The temperature was dropping again as it dropped every night now, with a speed that felt slightly cruel, a reminder of how brief the daylight had become and how long the nights would be. Marin looked at the ridge one more time. She looked at the place where the junipers clustered against the stone. In the failing light, it was just shadow and rock, and the dark silhouette of twisted branches. Anyone passing would see nothing. Roland Kress had passed this ridge dozens of times on his route through the valley, and had seen nothing because he had not been looking for what it contained. He had been looking for what he already knew, and what he knew was that granite was useless and dead. He had been looking at a gift and calling it a liability. He had been looking at a legacy and calling it dead weight. She turned and walked back toward the cabin through the frozen grass. Her face in the last light of that October evening in Montana was not the face of a defeated woman. It was not even exactly the face of a hopeful woman, because hope, as most people practice it, is a kind of waiting, a passive expectation of something good arriving from outside. What was on Marin's face was something more active than hope, more specific, and more determined. It was the face of a woman who has found the one thing she needs, and now understands with a clarity that reaches from her mind all the way down to the base of her spine what she must do next. Inside the cabin, the iron stove had burned low while she was gone. She opened the damper and added 2 logs, watching the coals brighten to orange and then to the beginning of red. The stove ticked and groaned as the iron expanded in the heat, the particular domestic sound of a tool doing its limited work. She sat at the table with her grandmother's booklet open before her and read the construction sections again, slowly making notes in the margins in her own hand where she had questions or where she needed to commit specific measurements to memory. She read about the channels and the floor stones. She read about the chimney dimensions. She read about the door construction, the insulation materials, the way to seal the entrance frame against the passage of cold air. Outside, the wind came back, moving down from the north with the unhurried confidence of something that has all the time in the world, It pushed against the cabin walls and found the gaps in the chinking and slid through them in thin, cold streams that made the candle flame waver. Maren pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and kept reading. She did not feel the cold that night, not the way she usually felt it, the way that went to the marrow and stayed there. Something had changed in the hours since she had pressed her hand against that warm stone. Something that had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with the particular warmth of having found not just a reason to continue, but confirmation that someone who loved her had seen this coming and had prepared her for it, across the distance of years and death. Sigrid had known, and Sigrid had trusted her. Tomorrow she would need tools. She would need the heavy sledgehammer and the iron wedges that Eric had kept in the small lean-to behind the cabin tools he had bought for the cabin construction and never quite finished using. She would need rope and a lantern and a bucket. She would need the pickaxe. Tomorrow she would begin. The first small storm arrived 3 weeks later, a modest affair that closed the pass for 2 days, and then relented. The hurt in her chest during those 2 days, the hurt that sounded like Cress and his deadline, she dismissed quietly. She had not gone. No one came to force her. Cress, she understood, had assumed the small storm was sufficient, and that she had either left or frozen. He was not a man who checked his assumptions once he had made them. She had not left. She had not frozen. She had been in the cave. Above the cabin that night of the first storm, the Montana sky thickened with cloud, and the temperature fell through the darkness toward numbers that had no business arriving this early in the season. And the silence that had been building all day settled finally and completely over the grasslands and the frozen creek and the gray ridge and the small imperfect cabin where a 19-year-old widow sat by the light of a candle and read from the careful English sentences of a dead woman who had always been warm and who had always known where the warmth was, how to survive, what was coming. The sledgehammer weighed 12 pounds. Maren knew this because Eric had told her when he bought it with the particular pride men take in the precise specifications of their tools, the way they quote weights and measurements as proof of seriousness of preparation, of readiness for hard work. 12 pounds, hickory handle, good steel head. He had used it 3 times before the fever took him driving iron wedges into the limestone ledge at the north corner of the cabin site, where the foundation had needed leveling. 3 times. Then it had gone into the lean-to with the rest of the tools and stayed there through the summer, and through the grief and through the first cold weeks of fall. Maren lifted it now in the gray pre-dawn light and felt the full weight of it travel up through her wrists and into her shoulders, and understood with the practical clarity that had become her dominant mode of thinking that this was going to change her body in ways she could not yet predict. She was not a large woman. She was lean from the summer's work and from months of meals that had been calculated more for sufficiency than for pleasure. And her arms had the wiry strength of someone who has been doing physical labor consistently, but not the deep, settled muscle of someone who has been doing specifically this kind of labor. She would build that muscle. She had no alternative. She carried the sledgehammer, the 3 iron wedges, and the pickaxe up to the ridge in 2 trips, the lantern swinging from her other hand in the first gray light of the November morning. The junipers were dark and still. She parted their branches and stood before the fissure in the rock face, her breath clouding in the air, and studied it the way Sigrid's booklet had taught her to study things, not with the eyes of someone seeing what was there, but with the eyes of someone imagining what could be there, what the shape of things wanted to become with the application of patient force. The opening was narrow, perhaps 18 inches across at its widest point. A badger might have gone through it comfortably. A person could not. The rock on either side was fractured, cracked in the way old granite cracks over centuries of freeze and thaw, and the slow, grinding patience of geological time. Sigrid had written about this. Work with the fracture lines, not against them. The stone is already broken in the places where it wants to break. Your job is not to break it. Your job is to help it finish what it has already started. She set the first wedge into a crack on the left side of the opening, angling it to follow the natural fracture line she could see running diagonally up and to the left. She raised the sledgehammer with both hands and brought it down. The sound was enormous in the morning stillness. It rang off the rock face and traveled across the frozen grassland and startled a pair of ravens from the cottonwood stand a quarter-mile away. They lifted into the cold air with a sound of their own, a harsh, surprised complaint, and then settled again somewhere she could not see. She hit the wedge again and again. A fine powder of rock dust fell from the crack. The wedge sank a fraction of an inch. She moved to the second wedge, then the third, working them in sequence, tapping each one a little deeper, before moving to the next, distributing the force the way Sigrid had described, so that the rock was being asked to give way along its entire length, rather than at a single point. On the fourth pass with the sledgehammer, the crack on the left side of the opening propagated suddenly a sharp snap that she felt through the soles of her boots, as much as she heard it with her ears, and a section of rock the size of a bread loaf separated from the face and fell. The opening was visibly wider. She stood there for a moment, breathing hard, looking at what she had done. Then she raised the sledgehammer again. By the end of the first day, the opening was wide enough to push the pickaxe through horizontally. By the end of the third day, it was wide enough for her shoulders. By the end of the week, it was wide enough to crawl through on hands and knees, dragging the lantern behind her. Those first 7 days established the shape and texture of the weeks that followed. She rose before first light, eating a small practical breakfast of cornmeal and whatever the thin cow had produced the previous evening, and she walked to the ridge in the dark, and she worked until her arms stopped responding reliably to what her mind was telling them, and then she walked back to the cabin and ate something and slept and woke and did it again. The rhythm of it was brutal and simple and clarifying in the way that only genuinely hard physical work can be clarifying, stripping everything away until what remains is the essential thing. The next swing, the next stone, the next small increment of progress. Her hands were changing. The blisters from the first 2 days had burst and dried and been replaced by new blisters that burst and dried and left behind the beginnings of true calluses, thick and competent. The muscles of her forearms, which had ached so badly on the second and third days that she had lain awake in the night, unable to find a comfortable position, gradually stopped aching and started simply being present and functional and stronger than they had been before. She thought about Sigrid a great deal during those early days. She thought about what kind of woman could have learned this knowledge, held it across decades and oceans, and the enormous distances that separate the life of a young woman on a volcanic island from the life of an old woman watching her granddaughter grow up on an American homestead. She thought about what it meant to carry something useful, so patiently waiting for the moment when it would be needed, trusting that the moment would come, even though she would not live to see it. She thought about the final folded page, its darker ink, its specific and remarkable foreknowledge. She thought about a woman who had looked at a land agent's map of a Montana valley and recognized a geological formation she had studied in her youth, and who had held that recognition close for years, passing it down in sealskin. That thought, more than any other, kept the sledgehammer rising. On the 7th day, she lit the lantern and crawled inside. The air hit her first. It was warm, genuinely warm. A humid warmth that was so different from the bitter air outside that her body went still for a moment, processing the information. It smelled of damp earth and sulfur and something older and deeper. The smell of rock that had been enclosed and undisturbed for longer than she could easily imagine. The smell was not unpleasant. It was the smell of something alive, something that had been alive for a very long time, in a very slow way, patient and persistent and indifferent to the human calendar. The lantern light moved across the walls of the fissure, which was narrower than she had hoped for the first 30 feet, and then widened into something she could stand in, not comfortably, but stand. The floor was uneven, covered in fallen debris and centuries of accumulated sediment. The ceiling was low in places and higher in others, following the natural irregularity of the original crack in the stone. And at the far end, perhaps 60 feet from the entrance, the fissure widened further into a rough chamber perhaps 15 feet across at its widest point. The floor here was lower, as if whatever geological event had created the cave had also pressed this section down. And in the lowest part of the floor, cradled in a depression in the rock that looked almost intentional, was the source. It was smaller than she had imagined. She had built up a picture in her mind from Sigrid's descriptions, and the picture had been more dramatic than the reality. No roaring thermal feature, no column of steam, no turquoise pool of boiling water, just a small dark pool perhaps 6 feet across and of unknown depth, its surface barely disturbed by the slow, lazy rise of bubbles from somewhere below. The steam it produced was subtle, almost invisible in the lantern light. A thin, constant exhalation that rose to coat the ceiling of the chamber with a slick of condensed moisture. But the warmth in the chamber was real and significant. It was perhaps 20 degrees warmer in the chamber than outside, which, in late November in Montana territory, was not a trivial difference. And the spring was constant. Whatever produced it lay far enough below the surface to be unaffected by the seasonal temperatures above, drawing on the Earth's own heat, which was itself unaffected by anything as local and temporary as a territorial winter or a land agent's assessment of geological value. Maren set the lantern on a ledge of rock and sat on the floor of the chamber and simply breathed. She had found it, or it had found her, or Sigrid across the distance of death and years had found it for both of them and left a map. She pressed her palm flat against the floor of the chamber and felt the warmth rising up through the stone from below. steady as a heartbeat. She thought of what Sigrid had written. Feel her pulse. She felt it. Then she stood up, took the lantern and began measuring the chamber with the length of her arm, pacing its dimensions, noting in her memory the placement of the natural ledges in the walls, the location of a vertical crack in the ceiling above the pool that might be widened into the ventilation shaft the booklet described. She was not a girl sitting in a warm cave, overcome by the comfort of it. She was an engineer surveying a construction site, and the construction had not yet begun. The real work started the following morning. The first task was clearing the floor. The debris that had accumulated over centuries on the chamber floor, fallen rock and compacted sediment, and the small remnants of things she chose not to examine too closely, had to come out before anything else could begin. She worked with the pickaxe and a tin bucket, filling the bucket and dragging it to the entrance and emptying it outside again and again and again in the cramped, warm darkness. It was the most tedious kind of labor, the kind without the satisfaction of a dramatic result. But it was necessary, and she did it with the same methodical patience she had brought to everything else. She hauled debris for 4 days. On the 5th day, the floor of the chamber was rough but clear, and she could see what she was actually working with. Then she started on the channels. Sigrid's booklet had given her the dimensions. Channels 8 inches wide, 4 inches deep, spaced roughly 2 feet apart, radiating out from the pool toward the entrance of the chamber. The purpose was to carry the overflow water from the spring across the entire floor, before allowing it to drain through the sump, a low point near the entrance where the water would collect and eventually seep back into the ground. The hot water moving through the channels would heat the stone around and above them, and that heat would rise evenly and gently from the entire floor surface, warming the space from below, the way the earth itself was warm from below. She carved the channels with the pickaxe, working slowly and carefully, following the natural seams in the rock where the tool found easier purchase. The sound of it filled the chamber, amplified by the stone walls, into something larger than it was, a rhythmic chipping that she came to associate with the particular kind of time that exists inside sustained labor, a time that is not measured in hours or minutes, but in increments of progress, in lengths of channel completed, in square feet of floor brought closer to finished. She bled several times when the pickaxe skidded on a particularly hard section of stone. It came around and caught her hands or arms with its head or handle, leaving cuts that she bound with strips of cloth torn from an old shirt and kept working through. The warm air inside the cave made her aware of every ache and cut with unwelcome clarity, which she decided was not entirely a bad thing. Pain that you can feel is pain you can manage. She thought during those channel carving days about Eric, not the enormous absence of him that had defined the first months after his death, but something more specific. She thought about his hands on the hickory handle of the sledgehammer, the 3 times he had used it. She thought about how he had bought the tools for a purpose, and how the purpose had outlived him, had found its way into her hands, and was being used for something he could never have imagined, but that she believed with a quiet certainty he would have found entirely right. She was at this work inside the cave, carving the 4th channel, when she heard hooves on the frozen ground outside. She heard them distantly at first, then closer, then stopping. She stayed where she was. She was deep enough in the cave that she could not see the entrance from where she knelt, and whoever was outside could not see her. She heard a horse blow out a breath. She heard the creak of leather. She heard a man's voice addressing someone, and then a second quieter voice, the murmur of a response. Cress. She recognized his baritone even filtered through 60 feet of rock. He was not alone. She could hear at least 2 other people-men. By the sound of them, neighbors perhaps, or business associates who had ridden out with him for some purpose. She set down the pickaxe slowly and moved toward the entrance, staying low, moving quietly, until she reached the point where the fissure narrowed, and she could see the opening ahead of her, the narrow vertical slit of daylight framing the curtain of juniper branches beyond. She crawled the last few feet and parted the branches an inch with 2 fingers and looked. Cress sat on his horse 10 feet away, looking at the pile of rock and debris she had hauled out of the cave over the past weeks. It was a substantial pile now, the accumulated leavings of her labor covering perhaps 20 square feet outside the entrance. 2 men sat on horses beside him. Men she recognized from town Pemberton who ran the feed store, and Jonas Whitfield, the farrier from the south end of Coldwater Flats. A quiet man who shod horses and kept largely to himself, but who had come along today, it seemed, as a witness to whatever Cress had in mind. Cress's face wore the expression she had cataloged carefully on his first visit. The particular arrangement of features that communicated condescending amusement. The face of a man who has encountered something he considers beneath serious attention, but finds briefly diverting. Mrs. Voss, he called out in a tone he might have used to address a child engaged in some harmless but foolish game. I see you have been busy. Marin let go of the branches and sat back against the cave wall, her pickaxe in her hands, and said nothing. Cress waited a moment, then continued, his voice carrying easily. Whatever this is, I'll advise you plainly. It will not satisfy the company's claim on the property. You cannot mine your way out of debt, and there is nothing in that ridge worth mining in any case. A pause. She could hear him shifting in the saddle, the leather complaining. They are calling this Marin's Folly in town, I should tell you. I did not originate the name, but I cannot say it is inaccurate. Let them talk, she said. Her voice was flat and even and came from somewhere the mockery could not reach. There was a brief silence outside. She heard Pemberton make a low sound that might have been a laugh. She heard Cress make a small dismissive noise in return, the noise of someone filing something away as confirmed, as settled, as exactly what they expected. She heard Whitfield say nothing, which she noted. Then the hooves moved away and the sound of them diminished, and she was alone again in the quiet of the ridge. She sat for a moment with the pickaxe in her hands and let the name settle over her. Marin's Folly. She turned it over in her mind, the way you turn a stone over to see what lives beneath it. She looked at it from every angle. She tested its weight. Then she went back to carving channels. The name, she decided, was not the worst thing they could have called it. Folly implied something attempted. It implied action. She had known women who had been given worse names for attempting less. And she had a grandmother who had looked at a land agent's map and seen what no one else had seen and had held that knowledge for years until the right person could use it. Whatever she was doing in this cave, it was the opposite of folly. It was the most deliberate thing she had ever done. The channels took 3 weeks. The floor stones took longer. She found the flat stone she needed in a dry creek bed, a mile west of the property, a place where erosion had exposed a seam of a shale-like stone that split naturally into manageable slabs, roughly even in thickness, wide enough to cover the channels and create a continuous surface. She built a rough sledge from salvaged juniper branches and haul rope, loading the stones on it and dragging them back to the ridge across the frozen ground, 3 or 4 stones per trip twice a day. It was work that made the sledgehammer feel light by comparison. The loaded sledge caught on every irregularity in the frozen ground, on every clump of dead grass and every patch of uneven ice. She fell, pulling it more times than she could count, going down hard on her hands and knees onto the frozen earth, rising each time, and taking hold of the rope again. Her shoulders and lower back developed a constant deep ache that no amount of rest seemed to fully resolve. She thought on those long pulls across the frozen ground about what Roland Kress was doing in those same hours. She imagined him at his desk in the warm land office, writing correspondence in his confident baritone handwriting. She imagined the North Star Hearthmaster stove in his well-built house at the edge of town, glowing red in the center of the room, while his wife moved through the domestic rhythms of a comfortable life. She imagined him telling the story of Marin's folly over dinner. The poor mad widow digging in the frozen dirt. And she used that image the way she used the cold, and the weight of the rope as a fuel, something to burn against when the alternative was stopping. She did not stop. The laying of the floor stones was the most technically demanding work she had ever done. Each stone had to be fitted over the channels without gaps that would allow cold air to pool between them, and without the unevenness that would create a dangerous surface. She worked with a flat piece of salvaged board as a straight edge, checking each stone's level, before moving to the next shimming low spots, with chips of rock trimming protruding edges with the pickaxe. It was a puzzle of enormous and unforgiving complexity, because the floor beneath was not flat, was not designed to be flat, was the raw floor of a geological formation that had been shaped by forces operating on a timescale that made human planning seem approximate. She was imposing a human geometry on an inhuman space, and the inhuman space resisted with the particular resistance of things that have been a certain way for a very long time and see no particular reason to change. She laid stones for 3 weeks. On the last day of that work, she diverted the overflow from the spring into the channels for the first time. She had built a small stone lip at the edge of the pool to direct the flow, working carefully, understanding that this was the moment when the design would either prove itself or reveal its failure. The water moved, slowly at first, finding its level, then with more confidence as it settled into the carved channels spreading out from the pool and across the floor in the pattern she had made for it. She watched it move in the lantern light, dark water and dark stone carrying its heat with it in a thin rising vapor. She waited. 10 minutes passed. 20. She knelt and pressed her palm against the floor stones above one of the channels, and then she pressed it against a section of floor farther from the channels, and then she moved her hand back, comparing. The difference was small but unmistakable. The stones above the channels were warmer. Not dramatically warmer, not yet. The system needed time to come to temperature, but the principle was working. The heat was transferring. The floor was beginning to warm. She lay flat on the stone floor and pressed her cheek against it. The warmth that came up through the stone was different from any other warmth she had experienced. It was not the sharp warmth of a fire, or the local warmth of a heated brick, or the dry warmth of the iron stove. It was a distributed warmth coming from everywhere below her, at once rising through the stone, the way dawn light rises through the sky gradually, and from all directions simultaneously. It had no center. It had no point of origin that her body could identify. It simply was everywhere she was, in contact with the stone. She lay on that floor, and she wept. Not loudly, not with the kind of weeping that demands witness or comfort. Quietly into the stone the way a person weeps when they are entirely alone, and the feeling is too large to hold, and there is no one there to see it. She wept from exhaustion and from something she did not have a precise name for, a compound emotion made of grief and accomplishment, and the particular piercing gratitude of someone who has been given exactly what they needed, by someone who is no longer alive to receive the thanks. She wept, and then she stopped, and then she lay there a while longer, feeling the warmth of the earth through the stone of the floor. And she thought about Sigrid. She thought about the old woman on the volcanic island, young once learning this knowledge from someone who had learned it from someone before them. The long chain of people who had understood that the earth was warm, and that understanding was the beginning of survival. She thought about a young Sigrid, examining a geological map, recognizing a fault line, making a decision, and keeping it for decades, writing it down in darker ink on a separate folded page, and tucking it behind the back cover of a booklet that would cross an ocean and survive 2 deaths before arriving in the hands it had been written for. She thought, I have done it. The first part, I have done it. Then she sat up, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and went back to work. The ventilation chimney was the most dangerous work. Sigrid's booklet had been explicit without proper ventilation. The cave was not a home but a trap. The gases the spring produced, carbon dioxide, heavier than air, and pooling at floor level, sulfur dioxide, acrid and damaging to the lungs, could accumulate in an enclosed space to levels that would incapacitate and then kill anyone inside. The stack effect chimney was not an enhancement of the design. It was a requirement of it. She had identified the location during her early surveys of the cave. There was a natural vertical fissure in the ceiling of the chamber at its highest point, perhaps 4 inches wide at its narrowest and widening toward the top, to something larger, a crack that ran upward through the rock and she believed emerged on the top surface of the ridge. She had confirmed this on a subsequent afternoon by pouring a small amount of lantern oil into the crack at the top and watching from inside the cave to see if the smell reached her. It had. The crack ran through. She needed to widen it. From inside the cave, standing on an increasingly precarious stack of rocks, she built and rebuilt each day she worked at the fissure, with the smallest of her iron wedges and a hand hammer, tapping carefully, widening the crack by fractions. Above her, the rock dust fell in thin curtains, coating her hair and face and the back of her neck. She wore a damp cloth tied over her mouth and nose and worked by feel as much as by sight. Her arms extended above her in a position that made her shoulders burn within minutes and made them scream within the hour. She fell twice from the rock pile. The first time she caught herself on the wall and went down scraped and bruised but without serious damage. The second time she came down hard on her right knee a solid impact that swelled the joint to twice its normal size by evening, and made the next 3 days of work operate through a constant specific pain that she learned to root around rather than through the way water routes around an obstacle in its path. On the 5th day of chimney work, the fissure was wide enough for the passage of air. She could feel the draft immediately, a faint but continuous pull that lifted the lantern flame slightly toward the chimney when she held it beneath. Good air in from the low entrance, bad air out from the high chimney. The principle Sigrid had described working exactly as described. The cave began to breathe. She built the external chimney over 2 days of surface work, mortaring field stones with a clay and sand mixture she made from materials she found at the creek bed. It rose 10 feet above the ridge surface, a narrow tower of uneven but carefully fitted stone. And when she had finished it and gone back inside and lit a small fire of dried grass on the floor of the chamber as a test the draft it produced, pulled the smoke cleanly up and out without any of it dispersing back into the living space. She stood inside and watched the smoke rise and vanish and felt the faint, cool current of incoming fresh air on the back of her ankles, where the low inlet she had carved near the entrance brought it in from outside. It worked. All of it. The whole system that Sigrid had designed and drawn and annotated in careful English for a granddaughter she would never see again. It worked. The door was the last thing. She constructed it from the salvaged lumber of a section of fence that had collapsed in the north pasture. The fence Eric had built in the first spring of their marriage, proud of his straight lines and his tight joints. She mortised a heavy frame together and filled the interior with layer upon layer of dried moss and grass. For insulation material she had gathered and dried during the work weeks. In small bundles hung from the cave ceiling. She covered both interior and exterior faces with panels of tanned cowhide, stretching them tight and tacking them down with nails. She drove through the leather into the frame. The fitting of the door into the entrance of the cave took an entire day. The entrance, after all her widening work, was not a standard rectangular opening. It was a fissure irregular at its edges, wider at the top than at the bottom on one side and narrower at the top than the bottom on the other. She carved the opening to receive the door, and she fitted the door to the opening, and she sealed every remaining gap with clay. When she closed it for the first time, the outside world stopped. Not diminished, not muffled. Stopped. The wind, which had been pushing hard from the northwest since morning, pressing itself against every surface it could find, looking for gaps and finding them in the chinking of the cabin and around the single window frame and under the door of the lean-to, simply ceased to exist inside the chamber. The temperature outside was 22 degrees and falling. Inside, with the door closed and the spring running its heat through the channels and the chimney pulling gently at the air, the temperature was, by her estimate, somewhere near 50 degrees. Not tropical warmth, not the blazing heat of a roaring fire, but steady and deep and alive the warmth of the earth herself, constant in the way that only the earth can be constant, which is to say, permanently. Maren sat on the warm stone floor in the silence, with her back against the wall of the chamber, and breathed. The silence inside the cave was different from the silence outside. The silence outside was the silence of absence of things removed of a world that had emptied itself of warmth and sound and comfort. This silence was a fullness. It was the silence of something complete, of a space that contained everything it needed to contain, and nothing else. She thought of Eric. She thought of him the way she was beginning to learn to think of him, not as the enormous absence he had been in the first months, the negative space in the shape of a man, but as something more like a presence, transformed by time and grief into something quieter and less ragged. She thought of the fence he had built, the lumber of which now framed her door. She thought of the tools he had bought with such specific pride. She thought of what he would have made of what she had done here. And she believed with a certainty she did not try to justify or explain that he would have been incapable of fully understanding it, and that he would have been very proud of her, and that these two things were not in contradiction. She moved her few possessions into the cave that evening, making 3 trips in the gathering dark, carrying the bedroll and the trunk with Sigrid's journals and the cooking pots, and the small table and the single chair. She built the small stone oven over the section of floor she had identified, where the channel water was nearest to boiling temperature as it left the pool, and she placed a ball of bread dough she had mixed that morning into the oven and fitted a flat stone across its opening. An hour later, the cave was filled with the smell of baking bread. It was such an ordinary miracle, such a specifically domestic and humble triumph, that she laughed, alone in her warm cave under the Montana granite, with the bread smell moving through the heated air. She laughed, the first genuine laugh she had produced in 6 months. And it sounded strange in the stone space, too loud and a little raw, like a sound that had been stored too long and had lost some of its original quality. Outside, the great white death arrived. She did not know its name yet. She would learn it later from the mouths of the survivors, the name the old-timers would eventually give to what came down from the Arctic in the second week of December. She only knew it as a sound. At first, a change in the quality of the wind that she could hear, even through the cave door. A deeper register, a more serious and implacable tone. The difference between a strong man speaking loudly and the same man speaking quietly with absolute certainty of his own authority. The temperature outside fell to 30 below zero, then 40, then lower. The wind came with it, not the gusty, variable wind of ordinary storms, but a sustained, relentless force that had been building across 1,000 miles of open plains and had arrived with nothing to slow it and no intention of stopping. She sat in her warm cave, and she could hear it working on the world outside. She could hear it in the chimney, where it pushed against the column of rising warm air and made the draft variable, sometimes stronger and sometimes weaker, creating a low, fluctuating moan that was almost musical. She could hear it in the small amounts of air that found their way through the inlet, a whisper that carried in it the cold, the real cold, the kind that was already, she knew, beginning to kill things. She thought of cold water flats. She thought of the North Star Hearthmaster stoves glowing in the center of their sealed cabins, the iron hot at its surface and the air cold 6 feet away, the wood piles vanishing under the demands of a cold that the stoves had never been designed to handle. She thought of the families who had sealed their cabins so carefully, following Roland Cress's advice, chinking every gap, hanging blankets across the windows, shutting out the outside world as thoroughly as they could, and who were now sealed inside boxes of inadequate insulation, with hungry iron machines that were losing the argument with physics. She thought of Cress himself, in his better-built house, with his better supplied woodpile, and she wondered how long better was going to be enough. She built up the stone oven's fire, not because she needed the extra warmth, but because she was going to need to cook for more people soon. She did not know how she knew this. She knew it the way she had known about the silence, the way she had known about the winter, the way Sigrid had told her the body knows things the mind takes weeks to understand. She was preparing. She was still preparing when the knock came. It was late at night, late enough that she had banked the cooking fire and was lying on her bedroll on the warm stone floor. Her grandmother's journals open on her chest, reading the old script by lantern light, and working to decipher words Sigrid had written in the language of the island. The knock was small and hesitant, the knock of someone who is not entirely certain they have found the right place, or perhaps of someone who is entirely certain they have found the right place and is not sure they have the right to be there. Maren rose and went to the door and opened it. The cold came in first before she could see anything. A wave of it so solid and cutting that it felt less like air and more like the absence of everything air was supposed to be. And in the middle of that cold, out of the absolute darkness of the December night, a shape resolved itself. Hester Drum, 60 years old, a widow herself for the past 8 years, a woman who ran a small kitchen garden in the summer and kept to herself in the winters, and had been throughout Maren's months of labor and mockery the only person in Coldwater Flats who had not called it a folly. She had not offered help. She had not offered encouragement. She had simply, on the 2 occasions she had passed Maren on the road, and their eyes had met, not looked away with that particular combination of pity and embarrassment that everyone else employed. She had held the look. She had given a single short nod, the nod of one woman who understands something to another, and moved on. She was holding a child against her chest, a small child perhaps 2 years old, her granddaughter who was wrapped in every piece of fabric Hester had apparently been able to find, and who was even so the color of ice-blue winter sky, her lips faintly purple, her small body shivering with a violence that seemed too large for something so small. Hester said nothing. She looked at Maren with the eyes of someone who has used up every other option and has arrived at the last door and does not know what is behind it. Maren stepped back and opened the door wider and said, "Come in." Hester Drum stepped across the threshold of Maren's cave, and the warmth hit her the way warmth hits someone who has been in the cold too long, not as a comfort, but first as a physical shock, the body not quite believing what it is being told. She stopped just inside the door holding the child, and her face did something complicated and entirely unguarded, the face of an old woman who has been holding herself together with considerable effort for a considerable time and has just been given permission to stop. Her knees buckled, not all the way down, but enough that Maren moved quickly forward and put her hands under her arms, steadying her and guided her to the chair. The single chair. Maren took the child from Hester's arms and carried her to the warmest section of the floor, the section directly above the hottest channels, and laid her gently on the stone. She unwrapped the outer layers of fabric, the ones that had gotten cold from the outside, and left the inner ones, and she laid her own wool blanket over the child on top. The child had stopped shivering, which was not as reassuring as it might have been. A body that stops shivering in the cold has sometimes moved beyond the stage where shivering is useful. but the floor was warm, genuinely, consistently everywhere. Warm. And warmth, the right kind of warmth, the kind that comes from below and rises evenly and reaches everything it touches, is a remarkable thing. Within minutes, the child's color began to change, slowly, like the beginning of dawn. It moved from the blue-adjacent pallor of dangerous cold toward something closer to pink. Her breathing, which had been shallow and irregular, deepened. Her small hands, which Marin had taken between her own and was holding above the warm floor, began to feel different. Less like stone, more like a child's hands. Hester Drum watched from the chair, and somewhere in the watching, something in the old woman's face let go entirely, and she bent forward with her hands over her face and wept with the silent, total thoroughness of someone who has been saved from something they had not let themselves fully believe they were in danger of. Marin sat on the floor next to the child and held her hands and felt the warmth of the earth rising through the stone floor and thought about the next few days, about how many more knocks might come, about how much food she had and how she would need to ration it, and how many people could fit in the cave if they lay close, and what she would do when the wood for the cooking fire ran low, and how she was going to manage what was coming. She was not afraid. Fear required uncertainty about one's own capabilities, and she had spent 6 weeks in this cave, discovering what she was capable of. What she felt instead was something more like readiness, a quiet and specific preparation, the internal alignment of someone who has been building toward a moment and now understands the moment has arrived. The great white death pressed itself against the Montana earth above her, against the granite of the ridge, against the stone of the walls and the ceiling and the door. It pressed with everything. It had the full accumulated force of 1,000 miles of Arctic plain. The cold that broke thermometers and killed livestock in their barns and turned iron brittle as candy. Marin sat on her warm stone floor and listened to it try. Roland Kress had burned the last kitchen chair at midnight. He had stood in front of the North Star Hearthmaster stove and looked at the chair, the way a man looks at something he once considered permanent, something that belonged to the category of objects that simply exist in one's life without requiring decision. And then he had picked it up and broken it against the edge of the hearth with a single decisive motion and fed it to the fire piece by piece. The stove had accepted it greedily, as it accepted everything with the indiscriminate hunger of something that had no loyalty to the material it consumed, no preference between good oak furniture and cheap pine lumber, between the work of a craftsman's hands and the desperation of a man who was running out of options. The chair had bought him perhaps 40 minutes of adequate heat in the immediate vicinity of the stove. 3 feet away from the iron, the air was still a cold that had no business existing inside a house. Frost had been forming on the interior walls for 2 days, thick and white, spreading inward from the corners in crystalline formations that were almost beautiful, if you were not the person watching them grow. His son, Thomas, was in the bedroom at the end of the hall, 11 years old, and sick with something that had started as a cough and had deepened in the 4 days since the great white death descended into something more serious. A wet rattling sound in his chest that Kress heard in his sleep and woke to and heard again and could not stop hearing. His wife Elaine sat beside the boy's bed in her coat and her hat, and 2 wool shawls layered over each other, holding Thomas's hand and looking at her husband with an expression that had moved beyond accusation into something quieter and more final. The expression of a woman who has run out of the energy required for blame and is now simply waiting to see what happens next. Cress stood at the window and looked out at a world that had ceased to make sense. The temperature had been below 40 degrees below zero for 3 consecutive days. The snow was not deep. The Great White Death was a cold phenomenon, more than a snow phenomenon. But what snow there was had been packed by the relentless wind into formations of sculpted hardness ridges and dunes of compressed white that looked like the surface of a country that had given up on the idea of supporting life. The woodpile was gone. Every piece of furniture in the front 2 rooms was gone. He had sent his hired man to the lumber yard at the edge of town on the 2nd day of the storm, and the man had not come back. And Cress understood without needing confirmation that the man had made the rational decision of someone who determines that his obligation to his own survival outweighs his obligation to his employer. He was alone with his wife and his sick son, and the last warmth of a kitchen chair slowly being surrendered to the dark. He understood in this moment with a clarity that felt like cold water thrown on a sleeping man failing. Not in the commercial sense, not in the sense that his balance sheets were troubled or his investments were underperforming, but in the fundamental biological sense, the sense that precedes all the other senses and makes them possible. He was failing to keep his family warm. He was failing to keep his son alive. Everything else he had ever considered important, his authority, his standing, his confident pronouncements about the proper way to survive a Montana winter, was so far beneath this basic failing that he could not even locate it anymore. It had become irrelevant in the way that furniture becomes irrelevant when it is burning in a stove. He thought of the settlers he had sold to. He thought of the Pemberton family with their 4 children. He thought of the blacksmith, Rudd, and his wife. He thought of the Miller family with the newborn twins born in September, 3 months old, now lying in a cold house with parents who had followed his advice about the North Star Hearthmaster stove and the tight-sealed cabin, and who were now, he imagined, in conditions that were worse than his own, because their resources had always been thinner. He thought of Jonas Whitfield, the farrier who had ridden out with him that day to Marin's Ridge, and had said nothing when Cress made his jokes, who had just sat on his horse and watched with an expression Cress had not at the time bothered to read carefully. The shame of this was not a small thing. It was not the manageable shame of a minor miscalculation or an optimistic projection that had failed to materialize. It was the shame of a man who had sold certainty he did not possess to people who trusted him and who had collected their money and their faith in their old stone fireplaces that had served their grandparents and had given them in return a philosophy that was now freezing them to death. He stood at the window for a long time, and then, because desperation is a more powerful solvent than pride, because it dissolves the things pride is made of, with a thoroughness that nothing else quite manages, he thought of Marin Voss. He had tried not to. He had been trying not to for 2 days, which was roughly how long the thought had been pushing at the edges of his mind, requesting admission being denied. He had built arguments against it. She was dead by now, obviously the foolish girl in her foolish half-built cabin on her worthless land. The cave she had been digging was a tomb, and she had moved into it. And that was the end of the story. A sad story. A cautionary tale about stubbornness and the consequences of refusing the practical wisdom of people who knew better. But the image that kept returning unbidden and unwelcome was not the image of a frozen woman. It was the image of her face on that second visit when he had sat on his horse and called her project a folly, and she had come out of the hole in the rock with dirt on her face and sweat on her brow despite the freezing air. And she had looked at him with eyes that contained nothing he recognized. No fear. No apology. No performance of deference. Just the steady, focused look of someone engaged in work they understand and are committed to. Let them talk, she had said. And she had gone back into the dark. What if the dark was warm? The thought was absurd. He knew it was absurd. He was a man who understood land and resources and the practical mathematics of survival. And everything he understood told him that a lone 19-year-old woman with hand tools and a dead husband's equipment could not have created in 6 weeks a viable dwelling place inside solid granite rock. It was not possible. It was not the kind of thing that was possible. But Thomas's cough came through the wall again, a sound that had changed timbre over the past hours in a way that Cress recognized as change in the wrong direction, and the last heat of the kitchen chair was surrendering to the cold, and his certainty about what was possible was worth exactly as much as the rest of his certainties had turned out to be worth. He put on every layer of clothing he owned. He put on his wool trousers and his heavy wool shirt and his winter coat and his fur-collared overcoat on top of that, and his hat with the ear flaps that he normally considered undignified and had not worn in public in 3 years, and his heaviest boots and 2 pairs of gloves pulling the outer pair over the inner, with the deliberate methodical movements of a man who is rationing his dignity along with everything else, and has decided the ration for today is 0. He told Elaine he would be back. She looked at him without asking where he was going, which meant she already knew or suspected or was beyond the point where destinations mattered, and only returns did. He opened the front door, and the great white death walked in. He had been inside for 3 days. He had forgotten in the way that the body forgets extremes when it is no longer experiencing them the actual physical reality of the cold outside. It was not a temperature. It was a presence, a force with intention. Something that moved against him. Not like weather, but like opposition. Like the physical manifestation of everything that had ever worked against him, condensed and applied without mercy to every surface of his body simultaneously. He put his head down and walked. The wind was a solid thing. It came from the northwest with a consistency that was almost architectural. A wall of moving air so cold it burned exposed skin in seconds and penetrated even his doubled layers within minutes, finding the gaps with the patient thoroughness of something that has all the time in the world and knows it. He walked with his face turned slightly to the right, presenting his cheek to the wind rather than his full face, a small tactical concession to physics. The road to the Voss property was a mile. Under ordinary conditions, he could have walked it in 20 minutes. In this wind, in this cold over ground that had been scoured and packed and made treacherous by 3 days of the worst weather in the territory's recorded history. It took him the better part of an hour. He fell 4 times. The first fall was surprise. The second was the body's protest. The third and fourth were simply the ongoing negotiation between a 53-year-old man and the physical demands being placed on him, a negotiation in which his body was not winning, but was refusing to concede. He found the property by the fence posts he remembered from his visits, dark vertical lines in the white. He found the cabin first stop before it and looked. The cabin was a tomb. He had known it would be. The door was buried under a drift of wind-packed snow that rose 4 feet up its face. The single window was a sheet of ice so thick it was opaque. No smoke from the chimney, which was buried at its base in the same drift as the door. The structure itself had acquired the stillness of something that has released its claim on the living world and become purely architectural. A shape among shapes no longer warm. He had been right about the cabin. He stood there in the killing wind and absorbed this for a moment. He had been right. She had abandoned the cabin for the cave, and the cave he was still nearly certain was also a failure, and she was dead in there. And he had walked a mile in 40 below weather to confirm what he already knew. And now he needed to walk a mile back and figure out some other solution to a problem, for which he was becoming increasingly convinced there was no solution. He turned to go, and then he saw it. It was barely visible, and visible only because he was looking from the right angle. The angle that showed him not the front of the ridge, but the eastern end of it, where the gray granite curved around. A thin, dark line in the snow running from behind the cabin and up the slope toward the ridge. The kind of line left not by a single person's passage, but by repeated passage, a path worn into the snow surface over many uses before the worst of the storm had buried it. It was half filled with new snow now, but the depression was there, the ghost of a trail. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he followed it. The slope was difficult, the frozen ground beneath the snow offering unpredictable purchase, alternating between patches of ice that gave no traction and patches of wind-packed snow that were nearly as bad. He climbed with his hands as much as his feet, in places grabbing at exposed rock edges, using the irregular surface of the granite itself as handholds. The wind at the top of the slope was worse than at the base, unobstructed by the small shelter the cabin's bulk had provided at ground level. He found the junipers. The gnarled, low-growing trees were encased in ice. Each needle coated each branch, transformed into something crystalline and brittle, so that the curtain of them rattled when the wind moved through them with a sound like the most delicate and terrible music. He pushed through them, his coat catching on their iced branches, and there in the rock face was the door. It was remarkable that he nearly missed it, not because it was poorly made, but because it was made with the specific intention of belonging to its surroundings, fitted into the irregular opening of the fissure, with a precision that made it appear at first glance simply to be a darker section of rock face. The cowhide covering had darkened with moisture and cold to a color close to the granite itself. Only the wooden latch, a simple carved bar of wood set into an iron bracket, revealed the door for what it was. He stood before it and did not move for what might have been 30 seconds, or might have been 2 minutes. He could no longer feel his hands. The toes of his left foot had gone past pain into the absence of sensation that is more frightening than pain. His face, the portion of it that had been exposed above his wrapped scarf, felt like something that belonged to another man. He reached out and lifted the latch. The door swung inward on leather hinges, smooth and silent. And what came out of the opening was not the cold, dead air of a sealed stone tomb. It was warmth. Not the aggressive, localized heat of a fire. Not the dry, consuming warmth of the iron stove at its maximum. But something he had no vocabulary for, something his body received before his mind could process it. A warmth that was ambient and total and steady and alive, rising from the floor and the walls, with the patient consistency of something that had been there long before he arrived and would be there long after he left. He stepped inside. His eyes adjusted slowly. The lantern light within was warm and low, and after the absolute white exterior darkness of the storm, it was for a few seconds disorienting, his vision producing shapes before he could make sense of them. He blinked. The shapes resolved. Hester Drum sat against the far wall. Her legs extended before her, a child sleeping in her lap. The child's cheeks pink and full of color. Beside Hester sat Jonas Whitfield, the farrier he had ridden out with weeks ago to observe what Cress had called a folly. And Whitfield's wife beside him, both of them awake and watching the entrance with the calm alertness of people who have had time to recover from shock and settle into the reality of their circumstances. In the corner, curled on the warm stone floor beneath a blanket, two shapes that were children sleeping with the profound total unconsciousness of the genuinely warm. And in the center of the space, seated on a wooden chair at a small table, unhurried and absolutely self-possessed, was Maren Voss. She was not what he expected. He had in the back of his mind expected to find someone diminished by the ordeal, someone who would look as desperate and cold as he felt, someone whose survival, if it had occurred, would carry the visible marks of the narrowness of it. He expected relief on her face, or triumph, or the particular bright fragility of someone who has been through too much and is barely managing. What he found was a woman sitting in her warm home mending a piece of cloth. Her posture relaxed, her expression that of someone engaged in an ordinary domestic task in the middle of an ordinary evening. Her cheeks were flushed with warmth. Her movements as she glanced up from her work and saw him standing in her doorway encased in ice were unhurried. She looked at him the way he imagined a person looks at something they have been expecting for some time and are not surprised to see. Cress opened his mouth. He was not certain what he intended to say. He had prepared no speech for this moment because he had not fully believed this moment would exist. His mind even now was struggling to reconcile what his eyes were telling it with what his prior certainties demanded. His legs decided the matter for him. They had carried him a mile in the great white death on reserves of warmth and will that had now been fully expended, and the warmth of the cave floor which had begun to work on his frozen boots and through them to his frozen feet, combined with the release of the sustained muscular tension of the journey to produce a sudden and involuntary buckling at both knees. He went down not ungracefully, not like a man collapsing, but like a man kneeling, which was perhaps the only distinction left available to his dignity. The stone floor was warm beneath his knees. The warmth traveled up through the layers of his clothing and into his legs with a sensation that was initially pain, the painful return of circulation to tissue that had gone dangerously cold. And then, as the pain diminished, something else, something that moved through him from the floor upward, and that he had no word for in any language he spoke. Maren set down her mending and stood up. She walked to where he knelt and she filled a tin cup from the spigot set into the wall. The condenser outlet clear, cool water that was the distilled breath of the earth. She held it to his lips because his hands were too numb to hold it, and he drank. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. "How?" he said. The word came out as barely a sound more breath than voiced the word of a man whose entire professional and intellectual identity has just been revised without his permission. Marin crouched before him so that their eyes were level. Her expression was not triumphant. It was not even particularly warm toward him, not in the interpersonal sense. Though the temperature around them both was 50 degrees and rising where he sat. It was simply direct and clear, the expression of someone who knows what they know and no longer needs anyone else to confirm it. "My grandmother taught me," she said. "She taught me that the earth is not an enemy. She taught me to listen for what it offers instead of fighting what it withholds." Cress looked at the floor, at the flat stones fitted edge to edge across the chamber, warm to the touch, everywhere warm. He looked at the faint steam rising from the spring at the back of the cave, curling up toward the high ceiling where the draft of the chimney pulled it gently away. He looked at the sleeping children. He looked at Hester Drum, who met his gaze with the steady eyes of a woman who does not feel the need to tell him what she is thinking, because she believes he is capable of working it out for himself. He looked at Jonas Whitfield, who gave him a single, measured look that contained in it the full memory of the afternoon on horseback, the mocking laughter, the name Marin's Folly spoken with such easy certainty. Then Roland Cress did something he had not done since he was a boy, since before he had become the kind of man for whom such things were incompatible with the image he had built and sustained and armored himself within for 30 years. He wept. Not politely, not with the restrained dignity of a man managing an emotion in public. He wept with the total graceless thoroughness of someone from whom a great weight has been removed so suddenly that the removal itself is disorienting someone who has been braced against something for so long that when the thing finally gives way, the bracing itself becomes a kind of falling. He wept for Thomas coughing in the cold house a mile away. He wept for the Pemberton children and the Miller twins and all the people who had trusted him and received in return a philosophy that was failing them in the worst cold in living memory. He wept for the arrogance that had felt like confidence for so long. He had stopped being able to tell them apart. He wept because the floor was warm and the air was breathable and a 19-year-old widow had done in 6 weeks alone. What he had told himself and everyone around him was impossible. Marin let him weep. She did not tell him it was all right because it was not all right. She did not comfort him with false equivalence or easy absolution. She stood nearby and let him be what he was, which was a man confronting the full weight of his own mistakes, in the only environment where that confrontation could produce something useful, which was warmth. When the weeping was finished, when he had come through the other side of it, and arrived at the particular stillness that follows genuine grief, Marin spoke. "Your family," she said. "Where are they?" "The house." He found his voice with some difficulty. "Thomas is sick. The chest." Marin looked at the space available in the cave, doing the calculation that she had been running continuously in her mind since Hester arrived, the calculus of warmth and space and food, and the number of people the earth's heat could sustain. She looked at the spring, steady and constant, undiminished by 3 days of use, indifferent to the demand placed on it, the way the earth is indifferent to the pace at which humans require its gifts. "Can you walk back?" she said, not as a challenge, as a practical question. "Yes." "Then rest first. 20 minutes. Then we go together." Those 20 minutes changed him in ways the previous 53 years had not. He sat on the warm stone floor, with his back against the cave wall, and watched Maren Voss move through her space with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned precisely where everything is and why. She added material to the cooking fire. She checked the child in Hester's lap, pressing the back of her hand to the small forehead with a tenderness that was entirely unself-conscious. She spoke quietly to Jonas Whitfield about the food supply, about what remained, and how long it would last if the census of people in the cave increased. Her voice low and practical, covering the logistics with the same calm she brought to everything else. She was, he understood, the most competent person he had ever been in a room with. They went out together into the storm, Maren with a lantern and the rope she had used to haul stones from the creek bed, and they made it to the house by holding the rope between them when the wind tried to separate them, moving in single file with Cress leading because he knew the ground, and Maren following because she knew how to move in cold without panicking it. They found Elaine and Thomas. The boy was bad, but not yet beyond recovery. His breathing labored, his skin too pale but responsive when Maren touched his face and spoke his name in a clear, calm voice. They moved through the storm as a chain Cress at the front with the lantern, Elaine behind him carrying as much as she could manage, Maren at the rear, with Thomas on her back, the boy's arms around her neck, and his face pressed against her collar, using the warmth of her body to sustain his own on the journey. It was one of the hardest things Cress had done. Not physically, though it was physically considerable. It was hard in the way that facing the consequences of your own choices is hard. The specific, unyielding difficulty of moving through a disaster that bears your signature toward the only solution that exists for it, a solution built by the person you had most thoroughly dismissed. When Thomas was laid on the warm stone floor of Maren's cave and wrapped in blankets, when the terrible rattling in his chest began, gradually over the course of 2 hours, to soften into something steadier and less alarming, Cress went back out. He went back 3 times that night. Each time he went to a different house. Each time he stood in a cold doorway and told the people inside what he had found. And each time he watched the disbelief move through their faces, followed by the desperate willingness to try anything, because anything was better than the cold. The Pemberton family, the blacksmith, Rudd and his wife, and their daughter. The Millers, with their infant twins, both babies so cold. Cress carried them inside his coat, on the walk back, one against each side of his chest, feeling their small, inadequate warmth and offering them his own. By the 3rd trip, he was moving on something beyond physical reserves, on the particular fuel that is available to people who are doing the only right thing available to them and know it. Each family he brought through the cave door and into the warmth was a small, specific payment against a debt that could not be fully settled, but could be honestly acknowledged. 23 people in the cave by the 2nd day of what became 8 days total. It should not have worked. 23 people in a space designed and built by one person for one person's survival should not have been livable. And yet the earth beneath them did not reduce its output. The spring did not notice the increased demand. The channels continued to carry their hot water across the floor, and the floor continued to give up its warmth to the air, and the air continued to cycle through the chimney, and the temperature inside the cave did not fall. It fell outside. It fell to numbers that broke the thermometers the land office kept. It fell to a cold that the old-timers, the ones who had grown up hearing their grandparents' stories about the worst winters, had never experienced directly and had half believed were exaggerated. Inside the cave, the temperature held at 50 degrees. 50 degrees is not warm, not by the standard of a heated house or a summer afternoon, but 50 degrees is the difference between survival and its absence, and 23 people lying close on a warm stone floor sharing the heat of their bodies and the heat of the earth beneath them, discovered that 50 degrees is enough. It is more than enough. It is abundance when the alternative has a temperature measured in the negative. Maren managed the space with the same quiet authority she had brought to its construction. She organized the food, rationing it without making the rationing feel like punishment, serving it in a rotation that ensured everyone ate something every day, even when the something was small. She showed people how to use the stone oven, how to position their cooking vessels to capture the maximum heat from the channel water below the floor. She showed them the cold trap and its condensed water fresh and clean, and she showed them how to fill and refill the collection vessels so that the supply was continuous. She managed the ventilation, monitoring the draft from the chimney by holding a strip of cloth near the outlet and watching how it moved, adjusting a baffle stone she had built into the chimney's base when the wind shifted and the draft became variable. She monitored the spring itself, the level of the pool, the temperature of the water in the channels at various distances from the source, checking that the system continued to function as designed under a load it had not been designed to bear. Through all of this, she was not performing confidence. She was not putting on the face of competence for the benefit of the people around her. She was doing what she knew how to do, with the focused attention of someone who has fully inhabited their own knowledge and no longer needs to remind themselves that they possess it. Cress watched her. He watched her the way a man watches something he has fundamentally misunderstood, with the specific attention of someone trying to rebuild a picture of the world from materials that do not fit the picture he previously held. On the fourth day, Thomas asked to sit up. His color had returned. The sound in his chest had diminished to the clean sound of a respiratory system doing its ordinary work. He sat against the cave wall eating a bowl of thin but genuine broth that Maren had made from her dried provisions, and he looked around at the cave with the clear, interested eyes of a healthy child in an interesting place. "Is this your house?" he asked Maren, who was sitting nearby. "It is," she said. "It's warm," he said with the simple appreciation of someone for whom warmth has recently been not a given but a gift. "It is," she said again. It was on the fifth day that Maren found it. She had been reading Sigrid's journals each evening, working through the old language, slowly accumulating understanding word by word. On the fifth evening, with 23 people settled around her in the warm dark, she turned to the final pages of the third volume, pages she had not yet reached, because her progress through the dense script had been slow, and the journals were long. The last entry was dated in the year before Sigrid's death. It was written in a different hand than the rest, slightly shakier. The hand of someone who is writing with intention and care, but whose body has begun the long, slow process of failing. Maren read it slowly, going back over phrases several times, making sure she had the meaning right, because the meaning seemed too large to trust on a single reading. Sigrid had written about the valley. She had written that in the years before Maren's family had come west, she had studied the geological surveys that land agents sent east to attract settlers, and that, in the survey of the valley that would become Coldwater Flats, she had seen immediately what others had not. The fault line that ran through the southern ridge, the pattern of mineral deposits in the creek water samples included in the survey, the thermal indicators that a person trained in reading volcanic landscapes would recognize as clearly as a signpost. She had known there was geothermal activity beneath that ridge before any member of the Voss family had ever set foot in Montana. She had not told them. She had thought about it, and she had chosen silence because she understood that knowledge given too early is knowledge that cannot take root. The value of the hot spring under the ridge was not the warmth it would provide. The value was in what a person would become in the process of finding it and using it. You cannot give a person that becoming. You can only prepare them for it and trust them to arrive. She had written in the final lines, "The land they will call worthless is the land I chose for you, my Maren. The ridge is not a geological liability. It is an inheritance. I could not give it to you when you were a child, or when life was easy, or when you had no reason to need it. I could only leave it there waiting and trust that you would become the kind of woman who could receive it. I believe that you will. I believe it with the same certainty I feel the pulse of the earth beneath my feet on this island, the same certainty that has never yet failed me. The earth keeps its promises. So will you." Maren sat with the journal open in her lap for a long time. Around her, 22 other people breathed and slept and murmured in the warm dark of the cave that Sigrid had in a sense built for her before she was old enough to need it, before she had any idea what needing it would look like. She did not weep this time. She simply sat with the knowledge of it, with the full weight and the full gift of what her grandmother had done, and she let it settle into her the way the earth's warmth settled into the stone of the floor, gradually from below reaching everything. On the 6th day, with the storm still pressing against the ridge above and the temperature still holding at its killing extreme, Cress stood up in the middle of the cave and spoke to the people around him. He had been thinking about what to say for 2 days. He had composed versions of it in his head while lying on the warm floor in the dark, arranging words and discarding them, looking for the formulation that was adequate to what needed to be said. He had not found one. He had concluded that there was not a formulation adequate to it, that the inadequacy of language to the task was itself part of the truth of the situation, and that the best thing available to him was not eloquence, but honesty, and that these were not the same thing, and he had spent too much of his life conflating them. He stood, and the cave was quiet, and 22 pairs of eyes found him. "I owe each of you a debt that cannot be repaid in the ordinary sense," he said. His voice was not the confident baritone he was known for. It was a different voice, the voice of a man without performance. I sold you a solution. I told you the North Star stove was the answer to a Montana winter. And I told you to seal your homes, and I told you that the new ways were better than the old ways. And I was wrong on all counts, not mistaken, wrong. There is a difference, and I have been spending 6 days understanding the difference. He turned to where Marin sat, and he did not look away when he found her eyes. I came to this woman's property, and I told her the land was worthless. I told her the ridge was dead weight. I told her she was foolish and stubborn, and that she was going to die if she stayed. He paused. She stayed. She built this. She built what you are sitting in right now. What has kept 23 of us alive alone in 6 weeks? With hand tools and her grandmother's knowledge, and a quality of determination that I do not have a word for, because the words I have were built for smaller things. The cave was very quiet. When this storm breaks, the debt on the Voss property is canceled. All of it. Every dollar, every cent of interest, every fee the company has accrued. The land is hers, free and unconditional. And if the company objects to that, they can speak to me, and I will explain to them the precise nature and extent of their moral obligation. He looked around at the faces watching him. And I will be spending the rest of the winter figuring out how to make right what I have made wrong with each of you. I do not know how, but I know that I will begin, because the alternative is to be the man I have been, and I am no longer willing to be that man. The silence that followed was not the silence of discomfort or uncertainty. It was the silence of a room full of people absorbing something real, something that had landed with the specific weight of words spoken from a place of genuine, rather than performed conviction. Hester drummed from her position against the wall, looked at Cress with a long, measuring gaze that contained in it the full depth of what she had witnessed over the past weeks. Marin's labor, the community's mockery, the crisis, and the solution. Then she gave a single short nod, the same nod she had given Marin on the road in the autumn, the nod of someone who sees the thing they were waiting to see and acknowledges it without ceremony. It was Marin who spoke next, and she did not speak to Cress but to the room. "When we go back out," she said, "I want to show you something. There are signs in this valley, the same signs my grandmother taught me to look for, that suggest the spring beneath this ridge is not alone. The geological formation that produced it runs along the south face of the valley. There may be other sources. I want to look for them in the spring. I want to look with all of you because finding them and using them will require more than one pair of hands, and because the knowledge that makes it possible should belong to this community, not to one person." She paused, and in the pause the spring bubbled its steady, patient bubble, and the warmth rose from the stone floor in its undemonstrative, consistent way. "My grandmother wrote that the earth gives," Marin said. "She does not give to individuals. She gives to people who know how to live with her. I think we are beginning to learn that." The storm broke on the morning of the 8th day. It did not end dramatically. There was no sudden clearing, no shaft of sunlight breaking through clouds. The wind simply diminished over the course of several hours from its sustained killing force to something that was merely cold, merely difficult, merely the ordinary hostility of a Montana December. rather than the extraordinary hostility of the great white death. The temperature rose from its impossible depths toward numbers that were still brutal, but were within the range of what humans could be in and continue to function. They opened the cave door in the early afternoon. The world outside was white and silent and utterly transformed. The storm had scoured the landscape down to its essentials, removing everything that was not firmly anchored, reshaping every surface, creating a terrain that was familiar in its basic geography and completely unfamiliar in its specific topography. The valley below the ridge looked wider somehow, the landmarks redistributed by the snow into new configurations. They came out one by one, blinking in the flat, bright light, their breath clouding in air that was cold, but breathable cold, but not predatory. They stood on the slope below the ridge and looked at Coldwater Flats, below the buildings intact, the smoke that was beginning to rise from various chimneys as people returned to their houses and rebuilt their fires. Thomas Cress stood beside his father in the cold air, his color good, his breathing clean, and he put his hand into his father's hand, without being asked, the instinctive gesture of a child who has been frightened and is now safe and wants to touch the person responsible for his safety. Cress looked down at the boy's hand in his and understood in the quiet way of understanding that arrives after the dramatic understanding is already finished, what he had almost lost and what, through no merit of his own, he had been given back. He looked up at Marin, who stood slightly apart from the group on the slope, looking not at Coldwater Flats, but at the valley, at the shape of the land, reading it the way Sigrid had taught her to read it, looking for the subtle signs that the earth was warm, somewhere below that the fault line continued, that the gift was larger than any one spring beneath any one ridge. In the weeks that followed, Coldwater Flats rebuilt itself in ways no one who had left it before the storm would have recognized. The rebuilding was not driven by Roland Cress, though he participated with a diligence and a humility that the community noted and respected. It was driven by Marin Voss, who had never asked to lead anything, and who led by the simple method of knowing what she knew and teaching it to anyone who wanted to learn. She taught them to read the land. She walked the valley with groups of 2 and 3 at a time, pointing to the signs her grandmother's booklet had described: the discolored rock at the base of certain slopes, the specific mosses, the way snow melted unevenly in patches above subsurface warmth. She taught them the geological logic of the valley, how the same fault that had produced the spring beneath her ridge extended through the south-facing hillsides, how the pressure and heat that generated her spring could produce other springs, smaller and larger, at points where the fault met the surface. They found 2 more in the spring thaw, exactly where the signs suggested they would be. One smaller than Marin's, one considerably large enough to supply the communal bathhouse that the community built above it in April. A long, warm building where the people of Coldwater Flats came on winter evenings, not just to wash, but to gather, to talk, to conduct the social business of a community in the way that communities had always conducted it, around a common source of warmth. The new houses went up through the spring and summer, built by people who had survived the winter and had drawn from it specific and practical lessons that they were not inclined to forget. They were built into the south-facing hillsides using the earth itself as their primary insulation, their thick soil and sod roofs growing grass, by July, their stone floors incorporating the channel systems that Marin demonstrated, at each building site adjusting the design to the specific thermal characteristics of each location. The North Star Hearth Master stoves were melted down at Rudd the blacksmith's forge across 3 days in early May, the iron recast into plowshares and gate hinges, and the heads of new tools. The blacksmith did this work with a focused pleasure that was not vindictive, but was something close to it, the satisfaction of a craftsman transforming a bad tool into good ones. Coldwater Flats did not become a famous place overnight, but it became known gradually across the territory in the particular way that practical knowledge spreads through communities that depend on survival. Travelers came through in subsequent years and asked questions about the unusual architecture, the houses that seemed to grow from the hillsides, the streets where the steam from subsurface vents made small, low clouds in winter mornings. They were directed, these travelers, to the woman on the ridge. She was never a woman who sought the center of things. She did not attend every meeting or chair every committee or accept every invitation to speak. She lived in her cave, which she had expanded over subsequent winters carefully and systematically, adding rooms the way a tree adds rings each edition, informed by accumulated knowledge and by the specific gifts of the earth beneath that particular section of ridge. The spring never diminished. The warmth never wavered. Years passed. The way years do in places where the work is real and the seasons are honest about what they require. They passed with a weight and a texture that shallower years do not possess. Marin Voss did not remarry. She was not lonely in the way people assumed a woman living alone must be lonely, because she had the company of the work which was always ongoing, and the company of the people who came to learn which was frequent, and the company of the land which was, she had discovered, a richer and more sustaining relationship than most people understood, was possible because most people had never learned to listen to it. She kept Sigrid's journals. She read them through over the years with a patience that matched the patience with which Sigrid had written them, learning the old language slowly word by word, the way the earth builds heat in its deep places gradually and from enormous depth. By the time she was 30, she could read them fluently. By the time she was 40, she was writing her own annotations in the margins, her own observations from her own practice, her own additions to the knowledge that Sigrid had carried across an ocean and preserved in sealskin against the moment it would be needed. By the time she was 50, she had begun a 4th volume of her own, written in both languages, the old island tongue and the English of the American West, so that whatever came after her would have no difficulty with translation. On summer evenings, when the light over the valley had that particular quality that Montana evenings have in late June, long and golden and somehow slower than light has any right to be, she would sit at the entrance to the cave, on a flat ledge of rock she had shaped for exactly this purpose, and she would watch. The valley below was different from the valley that Roland Kress had surveyed and assessed and priced and sold. It was the same land, the same geology, the same 30 acres of complicated topography that he had called a liability. But it had been understood now. It had been listened to. And the listening had changed. Not the land, but the people on it had made them into a different kind of community than they had been before, the kind that knows where its warmth comes from and respects the source and teaches its children to do the same. The children of the children she had sheltered in the cave played in the valley below her. In the long summer evenings, their voices carrying up the slope with the high unconscious music of children who are entirely located in the present moment. They did not know, those children, the specific details of what had happened in the cave in the winter of the Great White Death. They knew it as a story. The story that everyone in Coldwater Flats knew, the story of the warm cave and the cold storm, and the woman who had built one and survived the other. They knew it the way communities know their foundational stories, as something that explains where they come from and why they are the way they are. They also knew because Maren had made certain they knew the name of the woman who had made it possible from a greater distance. Sigrid, they knew. They knew her the way they knew the names of the springs, as something that had been there before them and would be there after them, as a name that belonged to the valley as much as the granite ridge belonged to it, as permanent and as warm. Maren watched the children and felt in the specific way available to people who have lived their lives in alignment with what they actually are. The satisfaction of someone who has done the thing they were made to do and done it well, and who has also in the doing passed it forward. That was the part Sigrid had understood, not just the knowledge itself, not just the technical precision of channels and ventilation and the stack effect of a well-built chimney, but the shape of how knowledge travels through time. It does not travel in books alone, though. Books help. It travels in people, in the particular kind of person who receives a hard thing and does not put it down, who carries it through the impossible work of becoming someone equal to it, and who then, at the far end of that work, turns around and holds it out to whoever is ready to take it next. The fire beneath their feet had always been there. It had been there long before Roland Kress assessed the land and found it wanting, long before Eric Voss bought it, with his young man's optimism, long before Sigrid had crossed an ocean, carrying the knowledge of how to find it and use it and be grateful for it. It had been there for longer than human habitation had existed in this valley, steady and constant and patient and warm, waiting for someone who knew how to listen. Sigrid had listened and had learned and had carried it. Maren had listened and had built and had survived. And now the valley listened with her. All of it, the spring beneath the ridge, and the 2 springs they had found in the thaw, and the communal bathhouse, and the earth-sheltered homes, and the children who grew up knowing that the ground beneath their feet was alive and warm and worth understanding. The earth, as Sigrid had promised in the last lines of her careful primer, had kept its word, and in the keeping of it so had they.